Welcome back to the second half. You've been up in the attic. Now we'll go under the floors and up on the roof. The remainder of tonight's presentation will cover Old Mud's restorations. We've had 3 major restorations of Old Mud in the last 75 years. Each was intended, and successfully intended to save this historic building for future generations. Old Mud's first restoration was following World War II in the late 1940s. The Harrodsburg Historical Society set aside its vision of restoring Old Mud to its 1800 appearance. They may have felt the cost was simply too much. They realized that neatly restoring the old building to its 1850s appearance would attract an active church congregation that could keep it in repair. As this photo of the southeast corner shows, they did an excellent job. The newly restored building was the scene of Harrodsburg's 175th birthday observation in June 1949. The guest speaker was Dr. Milton J. Hoffman, professor of church history at the Theological Seminary, New Brunswick, New Jersey. The Harrodsburg Baptist Church had just been granted permission to hold regular neighborhood services in the new old building. In a brilliant bow to the strong desire to expose the mud daubing to view, a special window over a representative sample was cut out of the new weatherboarding on the northeast corner. The framed glass-covered window displayed the straw-laced mud daubing adhering to the wattle sticks set in one of the hewn timber posts. This photo appeared in a 1955 Courier-Journal magazine story. Turning the maintenance and repair over to church congregations worked well for a couple decades. The rural setting was attractive, and folks could still tolerate outhouses. The 1960s even saw Old Mud become mother again to yet another new church, the Harrodsburg Cumberland Presbyterian Church, organized there in November 1963 with a congregation of 65 members. They started at Old Mud in the spring of 1961. The Cumberland Presbyterians held 2 Sunday church services with Sunday school, Wednesday night prayer meeting, and a 2-week vacation Bible school in the summer. They replastered Old Mud inside, painted the outside, cleared the grounds, and built 2 sanitary toilets. In fact, the Harrodsburg Cumberland Presbyterian Church was so successful, it needed a larger, more modern facility, which it built and moved into in October 1966. This is the Harrodsburg Cumberland Presbyterian Church today, north of Harrodsburg, off US 127. The photo's taken off their web page. A Baptist mission used Old Mud for a while after the Cumberland Presbyterians, but the lack of central heating and indoor plumbing made Old Mud a tough property to keep occupied. Here are views of Old Mud's 4 sides that I photographed during my first visit there in June 1972. Notice the siding coming off the south side, the south side, where the great arched double door had been originally placed. The unused building was quickly falling into disrepair. Just days before these photos were taken, the Historical Society had observed Harrodsburg's 198th birthday with a picnic lunch at Old Mud, where Jim Thomas, vice president and curator of Shakertown, discussed possibilities for Old Mud's restoration. The immense success and popularity of Mercer County's restored Shaker Village at Pleasant Hill convinced the Harrodsburg Historical Society to pursue their long-cherished dream of restoring Old Mud to its original 1800s appearance. Of course, that dream included removal of weatherboarding to reveal the interesting timber framing and the wattle and daubing-filled walls. Milton Grigg, a restoration consultant and authority on church architecture from Charlottesville, Virginia, advised on the early investigations and then authored the study for restoration in early 1975. Work began in 1972. The first step was to remove the interior changes of the 1849-50s remodeling, a kind of architectural archaeology to discover evidences of the original construction. Harrodsburg Historical Society members joined in the work under Jim Thomas's direction. They were not disappointed in their findings. Here's a newspaper photo from December 1972 taken from the balcony showing the 1850s ceiling completely removed to expose the rafter system. Above the middle windows on the north side, they found the original framing for the high windows that had been over the high pulpit. Perhaps most exciting was the perfect evidence remaining of the great arched double door originally in the south wall opposite the high pulpit. It had been mentioned as a memory in the 1900 centennial address. The doors naturally became the centerpiece of the restoration. It took 3 years to formulate the restoration plans and estimate the costs. This cutaway view appeared in the newspapers in May 1975. The National Trust for Historic Preservation had already committed to pick up half the tab, and the Harrodsburg Historical Society raised their matching half in just 6 weeks. Work began in October 1975. Here are views of all 4 sides of Old Mud during the 1975 restoration work. The photos are from the Historical Society's files. Of course, the real centerpiece of the restoration was something we will not see tomorrow, at least not on the outside. The wattle and daub mud-infilled walls were to be left exposed to view under the firmly held belief that had been left exposed for Old Mud's first 50 years. Since the mud was to be exposed to view, a great deal of effort went into exactly replicating the color and composition of the daubing. The mud work was time-consuming and went right up to the scheduled rededication, which occurred June 16, 1976, with a dinner for Harrodsburg's 202nd birthday, attended by 150 people. The first sermon preached in the newly restored Old Mud Meeting House was in October 1976 by the Reverend Gorman Parrish, pastor of the Hopewell Presbyterian Church in Johnson County, Indiana, another congregation proudly descended from Old Mud. 42 came down for that service. Another 40 came again 10 years later for a service, and Hopewell sent a whole busload to join the Dutch cousins in their 2009 services. It would take another 2 years to completely finish the 1970s restoration inside and out and open Old Mud to the public. The finished masterpiece was one of 8 buildings on the tour for Harrodsburg's 204th birthday in June 1978. Exposure of the mud walls was certainly unique, and it attracted lots of photos like these August 1980 views. The unique building also was a subject for artists. This pen and ink sketch by Laurie Spear Curry, curator at Shakertown, was used on a program to cover an authentic Dutch Vesper service in 1981, put together with the help of Russell Gassero, the Reformed Church archivist, who's helping again 34 years later with tomorrow's rededication. In 1982, the Harrodsburg Historical Society published a 42-page booklet, I think it's still available, that gives a summary of Old Mud's history combined with photos of the restored building and the 1800s-style furnishings which were made and installed as part of the restoration. Now, unquestionably, the most iconic artwork was Mel Kester's 1981 painting of Old Mud after a winter snow. Mel Kester was a North Carolina textile executive who picked up a brush and started painting in 1969 with no previous training. He was soon to be known to the art world coast to coast. The Intagon Corporation of Winston-Salem in 1981 commissioned him to paint Old Mud for the company's Christmas card, which had featured a historic church building every year since 1967. Prints of Mel Kester's beautiful Old Mud painting have been very popular, and they will ensure that the 1970s restoration will always be fondly remembered. But reality is not quite as beautiful. Exposed mud is high maintenance. Without stucco or waterproofing, it absorbs rain and moisture, expanding, then contracting. When it dries again, hunks fall off, and worse yet, adjoining timber starts showing rot and decay. By the late 1980s, timbers on Old Mud's west gable end that bore the brunt of storms showed such alarming decay that weatherboarding was reinstalled in an attempt to stem the destruction. It wasn't just mud that was causing problems. A new roof for Old Mud was at the top of the Harrodsburg Historical Society's priority list in 1989, something that did not get checked off that list for nearly 20 years. Near the end of its second century, Old Mud was showing very serious wear. The roof was leaking, mud daubing was falling off, and rot was apparent in its timbers. Perhaps most ominous, the building seemed to be sagging, and a whole wall was beginning to buck out. Now we enter into the last long restoration, the 21st century restoration that the Dutch cousins have been so heavily involved with. The new century, the new millennium, dawned bright for Old Mud Meeting House. This was the January 6, 2000 headline of the local newspaper. Old Mud had been awarded a prestigious Save America's Treasures grant, one of only 37 given nationwide. Despite the headline, the $20,000 grant was only to help produce a restoration and maintenance plan. But the money brought much needed optimism. The euphoria, however, did not last long. Anthony Crosby, a conservation architect from Denver, Colorado, was quickly engaged to conduct a detailed assessment of Old Mud's condition. Crosby made 2 week-long visits during the year 2000. Tony Crosby's condition assessment report was submitted to the Historical Society in May 2001. It was not popular reading. The report's 100-plus pages document the already well-known problems, the need to replace the roof, the windows, the doors, the porches, and probably the foundation. More alarming was what Crosby's investigation found with regard to the mud daubing and the building beginning to sag. As experts are prone to do, Crosby put a technical term to the mud falling off the walls. The mud was delaminating. His long-term recommendation was to investigate some kind of waterproofing. And his short-term recommendation to keep the mud in place was, to say the least, not pretty. His report identified a half-dozen areas inside and outside in immediate danger of losing the mud daubing, for which he recommended nailing up plywood sheets to hold the loose mud in place. Much of Tony Crosby's assessment dealt with Old Mud's 200-year-old timber frame. He carefully examined every visible plate, roof plate, sill plate, post, beam in the building, looking for decay and rot. What he found was not encouraging. The massive timber sills running the full length and width of the foundation were badly decayed. These are the plates upon which the timber frame is built. Crosby thought the sill plate rot resulted from the foundation, repaired and rebuilt over the years, which protruded beyond the sills, collecting moisture to accelerate the decay. And you can clearly see the water collecting ledge in these photos. The assessment detailed other problems in the timber framing. The large section of rotted roof plate caused by the leaky roof was obvious, but less obvious was the role played by the horizontal tie beams of those 4 interior H-bents. Those beams were removed in the 1849 remodeling when the new ceiling structure was installed. When the 1849 ceiling was removed in the 1970s, 2x8s laminated with poplar were made to look like original timber beams. These were not structurally adequate, and Crosby found that the middle of Old Mud at the top of its long sides was listing or racking to the south, and on the bottom it was rolling on its rotted sill plates to the north. Here's Crosby's sketch showing the racking and deflection taking place. This was obviously not good. Here again, Crosby's assessment did not have a good long-term fix for the problem. And as with the plywood recommendation for the mud, his short-term recommendation for the timber frame was also not pretty. He recommended a whole series of braces to shore up the building with angled supports extending into the building, outside into the yard. It is not an understatement to say Crosby's assessment left the Harrodsburg Historical Society in shock and disbelief. There was naturally a good bit of denial, but what to do? Old Mud seemed to need a miracle. And it was a kind of a miracle that this guy came along about the time Old Mud's problems came to a head. Bill Faulkner owns a local heating and air conditioning business. He had developed a passion for the art of timber framing, which naturally led him to join the Harrodsburg Historical Society, where he soon, perhaps foolishly, volunteered to head up the Old Mud Restoration Committee. He was undaunted by Crosby's assessment report. He quickly consulted his friends in the Timber Framers Guild, put together a daring plan of action to fix Old Mud to last another 200 years. August 31st, 2001, just 3 months after Crosby's report, 24 white oak logs were delivered from Feldman's Lumber in Lancaster. Old Mud wasn't going to just be shored up. Its rotted timbers were going to be replaced with new timbers shaped on site. It was soon determined that hand hewing is a lost art, perhaps left lost. Saws were set up to shape the longest logs into new sill plates. The extent of the work to be done was such that chainsaws were soon replaced by the Wood Miser sawmill. As logs were cut to form the new timber plates, it was time for the most exciting phase of the plan. Another delivery from Feldman's, blocking wood and steel beams. A team of expert timber framers from New York, led by Richard Lazarus, arrived on September 17, 2001. These volunteers from the Timber Framers Guild were housed at the then empty Fort Herod Drama facilities and were kept well fed by Historical Society members. Their first task was to remove sections of wattle and daub so that steel beams could be anchored to the timber posts. The steel beams were extended in both directions entirely through the meeting house. The wood blocks were stacked outside below the protruding ends of the steel beams. Pneumatic jacks were placed in the corner block piles below the steel beams. And slowly the lifting began, slowly and very carefully, until the entire 80-ton meeting house was raised the few inches necessary to detach and remove the rotted sill plates. Part of the crew stand proudly, and I'm sure much relieved, in front of Old Mud, now standing 6 inches off its foundation stones. Rick Lazarus is on the left. Remembering the gospel story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, it seems appropriate that a timber framer with the last name of Lazarus was supervising the raising of Old Mud to give it new life. The rotted sill plates were removed from the tendons protruding from the wall posts, and Old Mud was ready for installation of its new sill plates. But first, the new log sill plates had to have mortise holes cut precisely to fit those tendons hanging out of the suspended walls of Old Mud. The fit had to be exact. Floor joists also had to be fitted correctly into the new sill plates. Corners and splicing into the one salvageable original seal presented complicated joinery challenges. Once all the pieces were exactly fitted together, the new seals were pried up and pegged into the tendons of the original posts. Here you see a successfully installed sill plate. By the end of September 2001, 3 rotted sill plates had been successfully removed and replaced. There was a topping out at Old Mud to celebrate the complicated timber frame repair, but much work remained to be done. The foundation, for example, was yet to be dealt with. Once the meeting house had been lifted and the true condition of the foundation could be seen, it was not a pretty sight. The interior sides of the foundation were falling apart, having been inaccessible to adequate repair over the years. It made no sense to lower the building with its new sills onto such a foundation, and it was a perfect opportunity to fix the problem while the building was raised. The only problem was the usual one: the cost. Much of the 2001-2003 old mud work was accomplished by volunteer labor, but some things like logs and a new foundation did cost money. Thankfully, old mud had a benefactor in Ralph Anderson, a Cozine descendant and a Mercer County boy who had become very successful as a businessman. He never forgot his roots in Mercer County, and he pretty much underwrote the cost of the first part of the 21st century restoration. Mr. Anderson passed away February 13, 2010. With Ralph Anderson's cash influence, Old Mud's entire stone foundation was completely rebuilt in January 2002 by Kentucky's Dry Stone Conservancy. Much of the work was done by Neil Rippingale from Edinburgh, Scotland. The relaid foundation was built right up to the new sill plates, leaving Old Mud 6 inches higher. The new foundation also eliminated the ledge under the sill plates that had collected water, helping to rot the seals. Timber work resumed in September 2002 with another cash infusion from Ralph Anderson. First on the agenda was replacing the badly rotted section of the sill plate on the south side. This operation required prying up the corner of Old Mud's roof. Top photos, the rotted section has been cut out. Bottom photo, the fully restored plate is ready for the rafters. Next were the 2 interior columns and 4 H-bent cross ties reinstalled in the 1970s restoration, but made of 2x8 laminated with 2x8s laminated with poplar. To improve the structural stability, the plan was to remove and replace these with solid timbers. The new sawn timbers were again carefully notched out in the yard with mortise holes and tendons for exact fitting into the timber frame. Lots of braces along with steel cables stretched between the roof plates temporarily held Old Mud together between removal of the 1970s columns and beams and their replacement with solid timbers. The bottom of Old Mud's interior was a beehive of activity crowded with steel beams still temporarily in place to add stability while replacing the columns and beams. Into this crowded interior, the new solid timber columns were set in place. And at the top of the vaulted ceiling, the new solid columns were pegged into the purlin beam and along with braces pegged in at 45 degrees. Now the 4 horizontal anchored beams of the H-bents were ready to be installed. Notice the large channel cut across the top of the beam. I'll explain in a moment its purpose. To lock these massive anchor beams in place without pulling the building apart, special short pieces were pegged into the mortise holes of the wall posts. The massive anchor beams were then lifted into place with these projected pieces fitting inside and locked together with pegs. The finished product. The upper area of the meeting house was once again cluttered with 4 cross beams and a couple columns. The solid timbers once again locked Old Mud's frame in place. And a little extra 21st century help was added. Remember the channel cut across the top of the 4 cross beams? It was to hold a tension cable out of sight, anchored at each end around the post of the H-bent. Here viewed from above, you can see the tension cables along the tops of the H-bents. Old Mud's upper frame was certainly not going to list or rack ever again. With the frame repairs complete, the temporary steel beams that had been used to lift the building were finally removed and attention turned to Old Mud's 11 floor joists. Around the two columns, stones were stacked to build piers supporting the floor joists connected to the columns. You'll notice in these photos that steel tension cables were also installed under Old Mud's floors to prevent any future racking at the floor level. Next, 31 concrete pads were poured on which to build concrete block supports for the 200-year-old half-timbered floor joists. This reduced their unsupported length, which had always caused the floors to be uneven and shaky. So here's what Old Mud's floor, what Old Mud looks like without its floorboards. The 1970s flooring was later reinstalled as a base for a new floor, which has just recently been installed using poplar, recycled appropriately from Ralph Anderson's farm fences. We'll see that tomorrow. Modern electrical wiring was also installed, hidden under the floors, behind the mud daubing, and above the cross beams. As you've no doubt noticed, a good many of the wattle and daub panels were removed during the timber frame restoration. Wattle sticks had been set aside to be reinstalled now that the frame was finished. So once again, mud and straw was mixed to create dabbing material, which was packed into and around the wattle sticks to adhere when the mixture dried, thus filling the wood panel, the wall panel. This ended the 2001-2003 segment of the 21st century restoration. The Harrodsburg Historical Society's resources had been exhausted, and Old Mud was wrapped in plastic, waiting for finishing. Old Mud had been through major life-saving surgery. And at the Dutch Cousins 2005 reunion, Old Mud looked like it had been through hell. Its timber bones and foundation may have been healed, but cosmetically it was a horrible mess, worse looking than ever. At that first big Dutch Cousins reunion in 2005, Bill Falconer appealed to this new group of Old Mud descendants for help, and we came through for Old Mud. The funds were raised from the Dutch Cousins all across the country to resume the work. After nearly 5 years, at last, in May 2008, work resumed on Old Mud. The first objective was to remove the badly leaking old wood shake roof. I think that roof had been installed around 1968, making it 40 years old. And that's a fairly good long life if the roof stays sound. But unfortunately, it had been leaking for the last 20 of those 40 years. The lower layer of shingles were first removed to expose the rafter extensions that form the overhanging eaves that create a slight Dutch flare. The soffits were boxed in to hopefully prevent Old Mud's attic from once again becoming a hotel to raccoons and other wildlife. The old wood shakes being removed had been installed on spaced or lapped sheathing that allowed the wood shakes to breathe. The new eco shakes to be installed do not need breathing space, so a solid layer of wood decking could be installed, making for a stronger roof. Once the new roof decking was installed, attention was turned to the west gable end. That side had borne the brunt of bad weather for 200 years. The badly warped weatherboarding from the late 1980s was removed to reveal how badly the timbers were weathered. It was a very disappointing sight. Many decayed timbers had already been replaced with construction lumber in the 1980s. A majority of the timbers that remained were too badly rotted to keep in place. For example, I think this is what is meant by rotten to the core. The west wall timbers simply needed to be replaced, and it was yet another expensive and unexpected setback. But if the wall was to ever be properly restored, now was the time to do it. The original timbers were reused wherever possible, but most of the west wall timbers were replaced in the summer of 2008 by new solid oak timbers cut and fitted to replicate the original construction. And at last, the timber framing really was completely done. By mid-September, the crew could get back to completion of the roof. Pictured here are Bill Falconer, Joe Hutchinson, and Jeremiah Eisenbeis. Eco Shakes were installed for Old Mud's newly restored roof. Eco Shakes are made of 100% recycled products. They are approved by the U.S. Department of Interior for historic building restorations to replace wood shakes because they have the same look as conventional wood shingles, but they don't rot, curl, discolor, bend, crack, or take on moisture. Eco Shakes are also lighter and safer than wood shakes. Very importantly, they are extremely fire resistant as well as hail resistant. They dramatically reduce the roof maintenance cost, and they come with a 50-year warranty. Best of all, they look like a wood shake roof, but without the problems of a wood shake roof. With the roof done and the west wall restored, the 2008 part of the 21st century restoration was complete, and Old Mud was wrapped in plastic to await the final phase. As I know from experience, a supportive spouse makes everything in life go easier. And Bill Falconer certainly has a supportive spouse in Linda. She not only was there all the way with him on Old Mud, she helped with the heavy lifting. The two of them donated all of their very considerable time devoted to the Old Mud's restoration. And I first met Bill and Linda at the day this photo was taken in October 2003. He was helping that day to dismantle the timber frame of the 6 Mile Meeting House in the Low Dutch Track. I had called Bill just a few days before to see if he could do anything to help save the frame inside an old barn about to be demolished. He and Linda dropped everything to save another Low Dutch meeting house. Within weeks, the frame was carefully taken down and stored for rebuilding the next year across the road in the Low Dutch Track. Bill and Linda's involvement with Old Mud ended with this phase of the 2008 work, but their work has helped us save Old Mud for another 100 years. And they are with us tonight as honored guests. Stand up. Of course, there was still more work to be done. After 2008, there was more work to be done, and there was money to be raised to do it with. For this final phase of the 21st century restoration, the Harrodsburg Historical Society selected Diana Rose and Emily Preston. Emily is with us tonight to co-chair the committee charged with completing the work. First on the list was installation of the weatherboarding to protect the wonderful timber frame that had been completely restored. When the Dutch cousins met at their reunion in October 2011, the weatherboarding installation was in progress. As with the Eco Shake roof, this is no mere siding. This is hardy plank. A wider board with a beaded edge was selected as typical of the 1800s appearance. Like Eco Shakes, hardy plank is also approved by the U.S. Department of Interior for restorations of historic buildings because it looks like wood weatherboarding, but it doesn't weather like wood. It will not warp or curl as wood siding eventually does if not maintained. And by the way, we know from the experience with Old Mud when warped siding can be worse than no siding when it collects and traps moisture behind it. Hardy plank is also very fire resistant, and it's woodpecker proof. It too has a very low maintenance cost and a long warranty. Old Mud's fully restored timber frame is now protected by a kind of bionic shell that looks like the original 1800s weatherboarding and wood shake roof, but without the constant maintenance worries and costs. With the doors and windows installed by the time the Dutch cousins met again in September 2013, Old Mud was looking very much like it had not only survived major surgery, but was truly on the mend, looking good once again. Now, these photos are from our reunion 2 years ago, and they're the last I have. And that's fine, because tomorrow we will get to see the latest changes in person at the rededication we have waited so long for. Now, thank you for your attention, and if there's any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Thank you.